started. Prior to that, of course, I was at school.
And you went into the RAF as a regular, or just for the?
Oh no, just for the
duration.
For the duration.
And from September 1939, then, were you actually in the RAF in September?
Well, I wrote applying to join, I suppose, the day after the war was declared, but it was probably a couple of months before I actually was called up.
And then, as you've told us in your book, you were eventually on Wellington.
Yes, in the end, yes.
And could you tell us how your last flight, how you were captured?
Yes, well, we were on an operation to Essen in the Ruhr, and somewhere over the Rhineland, as we were approaching Essen, another aircraft, a Wellington I think, flashed out of the darkness and across our bows, and we simply collided with it. And our aircraft headed straight for the ground. And I bailed out, and that was it.
And that, you were actually still in Germany at that time?
Oh yes, that was...
in Germany.
Yes. We were probably not far from the Dutch frontier, but yes, it was in Germany. And indeed, the first person to appear was a farmer, and I asked him if he was German, and unfortunately he said yes. Had he been Dutch, things might have turned out differently.
You spoke German, did you?
Well, not very much.
Enough to ask him if he was German?
Well, the Sind Sie Deutsch is pretty basic, right?
Were you, had you considered capture? Had it ever crossed your mind that you may be captured?
Not very seriously, no. I don't think one ever considered the future seriously. I think during the war one lives from, or dies as the case may be, from hour to hour.
So consequently you wouldn't have been very prepared for capture?
No.
Apart from the standard?
Well yes, that is so, but it wouldn't have made a lot of difference because I was in rather a bad way, and so I couldn't have really done anything about trying to escape.
It was your arm that was injured, wasn't it?
Well, my shoulder was, yes, and I had bang on the head, and I was generally rather moth-eaten.
So your situation immediately post-capture was that you were injured, and were you put straight into hospital then, or were you?
Yes, they took me to hospital in the local town, which was Geldern, it's a little country town, and to the local hospital, and they were very kind, and patched up my shoulder as best they could.
This would have been when, 41?
This would have been 42, yes, June 42.
So it may have been different if you'd been nearer to places like Cologne, some of those, or even Essen itself.
Different in what way?
The reaction to the locals.
Oh, you mean if they'd had a lot of bombs raining down on them, they might not have been very friendly. It was very unusual, I think, for a hostile reception, which is amazing, really, when you think of the devastation which the RAF and the American Air Force were wreaking. But I think, as far as doctors are concerned, business of doctors is to save life, isn't it?
Patients are patients.
So they were as helpful as they could be.
Were you interrogated at all at that time?
Well, not then, no, not until I reached Gulag Luft.
And you were taken, were you, from the hospital there to Gulag Luft?
No, I was taken to a prison camp hospital near Dusseldorf, which was a French prison hospital. That's to say, it was run by French doctors for French prisoners of war. And there was one other, well, he wasn't English, he was a New Zealander, one other RAF person there. And we were there for about a couple of weeks, I suppose, until we were fit to be carted off to Dulag.
If I remember from your book, your arm was still in a pretty bad way then, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, because after they put the shoulder together as best they could and strapped the whole thing up, nobody really did anything about it. Well, until one of the French doctors took all the bandages off and kept clucking his tongue and making mon Dieu sort of noises. But it didn't really work properly for months and months and months.
But it's fully recovered eventually?
More or less, yeah, 95%, I suppose.
Right, so presumably you went to Dulag Luft from this French camp?
Yes.
And what about interrogation there?
Oh, well, I was interrogated as other people were. It was a very gentlemanly business, as I'm sure you know. No sort of heavy stuff. The only thing they seemed to want to know was the names of my crew. I couldn't quite make out why. I annoyed them because I wouldn't tell them. But they did all the usual tricks, like producing telegrams from the Air Ministry, asking for information and so on and so forth. And however, I think I rather upset the person who was interrogating me.
And then from Dulag Luft you were sent
straight to Stalag Luft 3.
Straight to Stalag Luft 3.
Yeah.
And so we're talking towards the end of 42, are we there?
Oh no, we're not towards the end. Well, just from memory, it would have been well, in the autumn sometime, I suppose.
And you did you immediately get into the escaping? I don't know what they called it, gang club.
Not really, no. One sat and talked about it. You needed to have a lot of initiative to actually do anything about it, other than talk, have clever ideas and so on. But at the time when I arrived in Stalag Luft 3, or Sagen as we always thought of it at, although there was a semblance of an escape committee, it was not terribly effective. And people trying to escape right, left and centre, they dug tunnels which got in one another's way, and the thing was totally undisciplined, shall we put it that way. But when we moved to the new compound, which was built because of the ever-expanding number of people, the thing was taken very effectively in hand by Roger Bushell, whom you will have heard of, I dare say, who imposed ruthless discipline. And the deal was that if you would help in any way that you were qualified to do, whether you were a draftsman who could forge passports, or a tailor who could make clothing, or whatever you might be, if you would help, then you would earn yourself the chance of escaping on some communal scheme. Or if you had your own scheme and it was approved by Roger Bushell and the other mafia, then you would have 100% support of the system.
So once you got to the new site, the new camp, it improved greatly as far as escaping was
Well, it did, yes, because it was properly disciplined exercise. And as far as I was concerned, I had a friend, Lorne Welch, who was appointed to be in charge of what became known as the gadget factory, whose job was to make anything required which, broadly speaking, other people couldn't make. And Lorne and I worked together on this. And I mean, for example, but I suppose our most memorable achievement was to build the forced ventilation system for the tunnel Harry. But the story of how I came to be on the so-called delousing party to get out of Sargon is well, comparatively long one. I don't know whether you want me to explain. Well, one day I got a message saying that X, as he was known, Roger Bushell, rather melodramatic, but it was rather important that he shouldn't be known to the Germans, because he was a marked man anyway by the Germans. X wants to see you this afternoon at 3:30. Well, I couldn't think why. It was a bit like being sent for by the headmaster, you see. I'm sure I hadn't done anything wrong.
Was he that severe?
Well, no, but he was a ruthless disciplinarian. Well, so I went. And there in this room there were a dozen people with nothing apparently in common. And Roger Bushell walked in eventually and said, "Gentlemen, I am going to march you all out through the gate." Well, this was quite a shock. And the reason actually that I was there was that Lorne Welsh and I had long discussed that if we ever did manage to get out, we would try to fly home, not fly home, but fly to Sweden or whatever, borrow an aircraft from the Luftwaffe. And Lorne had discussed this with Roger Bushell, and it occurred to Roger that if this delousing party did in fact successfully get out, it would be under the guidance of two false guards who would be obviously dressed as German, as Luftwaffe airmen. But they didn't want their Luftwaffe uniforms, they wanted civilian clothes, but he knew that Lorne, if he was going to wander around Luftwaffe airfields, would find a German uniform very useful. So he offered this to Lorne, and then he said, "Well, there are two uniforms, who would you like to go with you?" And Lorne, bless him, said, "Walter Morison." And that is how, in due course, we came to walk out through the gate. And the scheme, which was brilliantly clever, depended on finding, or at least pretending to find, a louse in one of the huts. And if there was a louse, the Germans would immediately delouse everybody in the hut because of the fear of typhus, which was endemic at that time in Eastern Europe. But the trick was that there was no delousing plant, which meant a place where there were big steam ovens to bake your blankets and showers to wash you. The delousing plant was in the old part of the camp, and to get to it you had to go out and along the open road and back into the camp. It's one of the very few reasons that the Germans would dream of taking a Kriegi out through the gate, because if he was behind two rows of barbed wire, he was less likely to escape than if he was outside. And it did require a very delicate organisation, well, quite apart from getting all the necessary passes which were required, and timing everything so that when the real guards came in, they could be diverted with cups of coffee or something just long enough for the guard on the gate to change so that the new guard wouldn't recognize the old phony guard that was going out as being different and so on. It was very delicate, but it worked, and we walked out through the gate.
And you all went your separate ways then, did you?
Indeed. Most of the people planned to catch the train at the local station, which was only a few hundred yards away. And they were all standing on the platform when by grave mischance, one of the camp officers happened to get off a train and looked at one of these blokes and he said, "Commit," you know. And that was it, and they were all marched straight back into the camp, most of them, but not all.
And you then went on a bit of a misguided tour looking for airfields, I believe.
Well, yes, the airfield that we were planning to go to, as it turned out, wasn't exactly where we thought it was. And it also turned out, as we realized afterwards, that it was Whitsun. It was a holiday, and the Luftwaffe was on holiday, and there was no flying going on. It was an elementary flying training school, which is what we wanted. Simple aircraft, lots of strangers. And they would all have been doing circuits and bumps, and you know, we would have seen. But we never found that airfield, and we wandered around for the next week, finding unsuitable airfields, unsuitable because they had the wrong sort of aircraft, for example. And eventually got back to the one remaining airfield that we knew of, which was actually only about 5 miles from the camp, where in due course we were recaptured. But that was quite an adventure. If I'm permitted to go rabbiting on.
Please do.
Well, we laid up during the night. We were very exhausted by this time because we had very little food.
You'd been out for how long by this time?
About a week. And we had worked on the assumption that we had got to get away almost immediately or be recaptured because of the hue and cry which would ensue with 24 people getting out. And so our watchword was Sweden for dinner. And we'd therefore taken very little food. We couldn't take very much. I mean, you can't walk around dressed as a Luftwaffe airman stuffed with bags of food. Anyway, in the morning we got back onto the airfield on the far side from all the buildings and walked around the perimeter track, and as we walked around, a nice little aeroplane came in and landed, and the crew got out and walked away, and they didn't reappear, so we thought, well, why not us? And it was an ideal aeroplane. It was a little sort of, I suppose, 5 or 6 seater communications aircraft, simple. It was a Junkers 34. And so we got into it, and we were all ready to start up. The one thing it hadn't got was electric starting. So Lorne got out with the handle, eventually found where you put the handle in, and just as he was about to wind, he said, "Christ, we've had it." Here was the rightful crew walking out for their aircraft. So I thought, well, perhaps we haven't quite had it. So I switched off everything I'd switched on, scrambled out, saluted smartly. Best thing to do, always salute if in doubt. And the pilot, I think there were 3 of them actually, the pilot said something which I didn't understand. So I saluted again, because I couldn't think of anything else to do. And he must have assumed that I was just a dumb irk, you know, which he was about right, actually. So he went like this, okay? Well, you know what that means, don't you, on an airfield? So I scrambled up on the wing, and I was, as I said, we were very exhausted. I wound, and the engine just about turned over, but it didn't start. So I got Lorne up on the wing. He was a bit stronger. The engine started. We scrambled down, and our beautiful little aeroplane flew away. So we thought we'd had enough for the day, so we retreated. Came back the next day, found another nice little aeroplane, not so nice, mind you. Got into it, and we were actually winding the engine over, but it didn't start. And a Luftwaffe sergeant came walking out and said, "Was wollen Sie mit die Maschine?" To which there was no satisfactory answer, really. So I just said, "Wir sind englische Offizier." And surprisingly, he didn't become hysterical, as goons were apt to in these circumstances. He just said the immortal words, "Komm mit," and there we were, back in the cooler.
It's a very similar story to the von Vera story, isn't it? Although he actually was in the cockpit, I believe.
Yes. Well, we were in the cockpit all right, but the engine wasn't running. Mind you, who knows what would have happened if the engine had started.
That's right.
And as we subsequently discovered, our planned route would have, assuming we were on course, would have taken us right over the V1, V2 research station at Peenemünde, which I suspect was heavily defended.
Quite. And you had no way of knowing how much fuel was on board, or did you know that?
Oh yes, I mean aircraft do have fuel gauges.
Yeah. But you had no way of choosing an aircraft that you knew was fueled up? So.
Well, no. I mean, by this time, beggars couldn't be choosers. We took the first thing that looked, or didn't take, as it turned out, the first thing that seemed possible.
And after that, were you sent back to Sargon, or did you go straight to Cardiff?
Oh no, we were taken back to Sargon, and we were in the cooler for, well, along with all the other people who'd been on this delousing party, who'd been recaptured. And they all went back into the camp after the regulation 14 days or whatever. But we didn't, and they were very upset. We'd broken all the rules, let's face it. We'd worn German uniform. It was alleged that we had engaged in sabotage and espionage. Well, you could interpret, I suppose, trying to nick an aircraft from the Luftwaffe as sabotage, and you could interpret wandering around German airfields as espionage, I suppose. But they were very upset, and they couldn't think what to do with us. And they kept interrogating us, and they kept muttering about courts martial and sentences of death and all this drivel. And in the end, they couldn't think what to do with us, so they sent us to Colditz.
If I can just remain at Sargon for a little while. In your book, you mentioned that above your bunk you had a small model glider, and you were actually considering the possibility of getting out of Sargon with a glider.
Well, we did, and I don't. Well, all ideas deserved to be explored, however improbable. I don't think it could have been done. But who knows?
But is it possible that is what sowed the seed for the Colditz glider?
No,
it wasn't.
No, it wasn't our idea.
Oh, it wasn't.
Oh no. The idea was entirely Jack Best and Bill Goldfinch and Tony Rolt. They were the people who were the moving spirits in that. My involvement with it was pretty peripheral, helping to make a few minor components and so on.
Apparently most people did.
Yes, a lot of people did. That's the aircraft manufacturing industry, isn't it? You subcontract out the bits.
Right then. So from Sargon, you eventually finished up in Colditz.
That's right.
When you arrived at Colditz, were there people there you knew? Because we're now getting towards the middle of the war, aren't we? Or is it even later than that?
Well, we're now in July 1943. Yes, it is the middle. Were there people there we knew? Well, there were very small number of RAF people. Well, as I say, there was Jack Best and Bill Goldfinch, a chap called Van Rood, a Dutchman. Were there any others? Oh, Dominic Bruce, he was RAF. But
Bush Parker?
Bush Parker, yeah. But there were very few. I mean, nearly everybody, as you know, were Army officers. There were a handful of naval officers and a handful of RAF officers.
Was Barder there then, or did he come later?
I think he arrived later. Don't really remember actually when he came, but he came all right.
So everybody says. Yeah. Had you heard of Colditz before you got there? Did you?
Well, Colditz was a shadowy vision. Very little was known about it at Saga, and it was thought of commonly as the Straflager, the punishment camp, which of course it wasn't. People had gone, but no one had ever come back.
But you knew the name?
Oh yes, yes, yes. But I do remember eventually when it was decided that that was where we were going, and the first person in the cooler, because three of us went, Lorne Welsh and I and a chap called Jerry Hill. And Jerry Hill came into my cell and said, "Well, Straflager for you, my boy."
Was he one of the guys on the same escape that you?
No, he was just a person who, in the eyes of the goons, was wholly undesirable.
Deutschfeindlich.
He wasn't Deutschfeindlich so much as he subverted German guards. Principally, he's a fluent German speaker, and he was the sort of guy who would wheedle a form for a special pass out of someone in exchange for a bar of chocolate or something, you know. They just, and he had escaped, I don't know, once or twice, but he was just undesirable, so they got rid of him.
From their point of view?
From their point of view.
Very useful from ours.
But as it turned, yes, well indeed, he was awarded the MBE or the OBE after the war for services to prison camps or something. That's true, it's absolutely true.
Services to forgery. Right, and so you arrive at Colditz presumably by train.
Indeed.
And what were your first impressions of the place?
It very quickly became apparent that this was no Straflager. It was in fact, I suppose, the most comfortable prison camp in Germany. As you first walked into the courtyard, well, everyone seemed very happy, you know, and normal, and I don't know. There we were, nothing you could do about it anyway.
When you first presumably walked across the bridge, you must have seen the
Oh yes, looming.
Did that strike fear into your heart?
No, I mean it was a castle. No, I don't know.
I suppose looking at it today, we know the story, but as it had been referred to as a Straflager, and as far as you were concerned at that particular point, it probably was. It was later on that you realised it wasn't. I just wondered if there was any trepidation as you went into the place.
You see, so if you were a British officer, or come to that, an American officer, the treatment which you received from, well, in our case, primarily the Luftwaffe, was so correct and indeed friendly, really, that you didn't expect anything unpleasant. You didn't know about Auschwitz, but that wasn't their department when all is said and done. That was that was the SS or whatever. So no, I don't think one had any particular trepidation. Well, obviously you didn't know what you were letting yourself in for. But
didn't have a great deal of choice anyway.
You didn't have any choice. No.
So when you got there, basically, apart from the two chaps that went with you, there was nobody you knew particularly well?
None of those who were there already were particularly friends, though one knew.
From Sargon?
From Sargon, yes.
And when you got into the camp, did you get involved with escaping, or did you take up other pursuits?
I did take up other pursuits as well. Not to a great extent, because by that time escaping was beginning to go out of fashion for two reasons. One was that it was by now very difficult to escape from Colditz because most of the loopholes had been closed. And of course, as time went by and it was apparent that we were going to win the war, there seemed to be less and less point, really. And of course you got to the point when they issued that delightful notice to all prisoners of war saying escaping is no longer a sport, which it had been previously. There's no doubt about it, it was a sport. Play by the rules, and by and large, if you were caught, it was 14 days in the cooler. But then of course they got fed up with playing this particular game. They had more urgent things on their mind, with Germany falling apart around their ears.
And also, I mean, a lot closer to the end of the war, is it not a fact that the senior British officer actually said, "You're wasting your time"? It's counterproductive anyway.
He may have done. I don't actually recall that, but I think by and large it was just self-evident, you know. The consequence, of course, was a progressive drop in morale, because there was no particular purpose except sitting and waiting for someone to come and rescue you. You hoped, because you didn't know, of course, what the end would be like. The end could have been quite the opposite.
That's right. And of course, there was a school of thought that believed that the prisoners in Colditz were going to be used as hostages.
Well, of course, the so-called prominenti unquestionably were hostages. I mean, the Germans was denied that they were hostages. It was perfectly obvious that they were. And at the end of the day, they were in fact so used. As you know, they were taken off down to Bavaria, but not that they ever got there, but certainly the object was to use them as hostages. I'm bound to say I don't think they would have weighed very heavily in the scales against Adolf Hitler. No. But anyway, you know, I think particularly if you've been in the RAF and in Bomber Command and so on, you weren't exactly the most favoured character in Germany. So they could have decided to take it out on us, but they didn't.
As indeed they had the 50 men from Sargon.
Well, indeed, yes, quite so. But that was an isolated incident. It wasn't a matter of general policy. Let's have a final solution for the RAF.
But presumably you knew that had taken place.
Oh yes, indeed we did, yes.
Do you remember how you got that news?
No, I don't.
Did you make any attempts to escape from Colditz?
Well, not directly. I helped in there. I helped with a thing called Crown Deep.
Oh, right.
You know about Crown Deep? Based on this delightful fact, I think, that medieval castles' spiral staircases were built with the spiral going, which way was it? Clockwise upwards, that's right. You know this? Yeah. So that the defenders would have their sword arm to bang the attacker coming up the stairs. And in this particular spiral staircase, it went the other way, and everyone said, why? It was a fair question. There must have been some reason for building it that way, and what's behind that wall at the bottom? Well, Lord and I looked after the trap, the entrance to that. You can't hardly call it a tunnel, but a hole in the wall, until it was discovered.
Which staircase was that incident?
Well, I suppose if you stood in the courtyard and looked at the chapel, it would be in the corner to your left.
So, under the clock tower?
If you say so.
Facing the chapel, yeah. And that, because that had a reputation of being senior officers only, didn't it, Crown Deep? Or one of the books, I believe, says it had. I remember somebody at one of our meetings bringing this up. That it was.
Well, I don't recall who the prime movers were in that exercise. I only recall maintaining this wretched trap, which was a piece of cast concrete to fit into an irregular shaped hole in a bit of wall underneath a cupboard, and you had to put it in and then putty the crack with putty made from ground up soap and then sprinkle it with dust. The catch was that if you made your putty too wet, it immediately showed up through the dust. If you made it too dry, it wouldn't stick in anyway. So.
And you had to do this every time anybody went in or out?
Oh yes, more indeed, if they didn't go in or out, you had to go and dust it. But that was, well, it was believed to have been discovered as a result of that naval officer who, the traitor.
Purdy.
Yeah. I'm not sure that it was, I'm not sure that you can blame him, because he was never charged with this particular. When he was prosecuted, this wasn't one of the things that he was alleged to have done. Who knows? The fact is, it was discovered.
And were there any other incidents you were involved with? You said earlier you worked on the glider.
I worked a little bit on the glider. I helped John Beaumont, the chap who turned himself into a pile of rubbish, if you remember.
Oh, yeah.
That was an inspired bit of thinking. But that was only helping to cover up the fact that he had turned into a pile of rubbish.
He practiced, didn't he, for long
hours?
Oh
yes, he did. I mean, it's not easy to turn into a convincing pile of rubbish. To run the canteen. Might amaze people to think that there was such a thing as a canteen where you could buy things. Early in the war, of course, you could buy things, but by now there wasn't much in Germany left to buy. But there were a few things that, including a substance which was described as beer, which was in bottles, as beer is apt to be. And people bought these bottles and took them away and drank the beer and brought the empties back if they were good. They had to sign a book. And when they took these bottles away, and one of the people concerned was Jack Best. Now, Jack Best was a ghost, and so it wasn't very appropriate for him to sign his name, Jack Best. So he actually signed J. Balls to You, which summed it up, really, I think. But after that I returned to the theatre, which I'd done at Sargon a lot, and well, not a lot else, I suppose. The theatre keeps you very busy, I have to say.
That's right, and bearing in mind that you're doing everything, of course. Yeah.
Oh yes, I mean you've got to build the sets and the lighting, and as well as the wardrobe, and as well as actually acting.
How cooperative were the Germans in that, supplying equipment for that?
Oh, they were very cooperative. after all, it paid them to keep the little souls happy, didn't it? You know, if they weren't, if they were playing at being Hamlet or something or other, then they weren't digging tunnels. Mind you, that wasn't always quite necessarily the case. They could be engaging in a noisy scene from something or other to drown the sound of someone hammering underneath the stage or something.
Were you ever, for any reason, put in the cells at Colditz?
Yes.
Can you remember why?
I think we were stealing potatoes.
Oh.
There was a potato store off the courtyard, a cellar, and it had two things. It had jam, which was useful for making alcohol, and it had potatoes, which we were getting progressively more hungry as the end of the war came near. And the redoubtable Bush Parker, who could open any lock, was going to open this up, and we would nip down and carry off a supply of spuds, kartoffel. Well, I think one day it went wrong, and a goon walked in, and so we were clapped in the cooler for a week or something.
Do you remember which cells you were put in?
No. I only remember it was the middle of winter and it was blisteringly cold.
You never actually got to the town jail?
No.
And how did you view, was it that would have been solitary, was it? Or
Yes.
Just in
Yeah.
Because apparently some of the officers there felt that solitary was actually quite a good break at times.
Well, in a way, you could get away from people who were all too familiar faces, if you know what I mean. But I wouldn't choose it in the middle of winter with no heating.
That's probably why there was room there. Did you have, in fact, I think in your book you mentioned that you did try to send some coded messages home.
Yes. Well, that was slightly laughable. Well, that was from Sargon.
Oh, I see.
No, I had a brother who was in RAF intelligence and technical intelligence. And the new Heinkel, whatever it was, big 4-engined Heinkel bomber, was flying out of the local airfield. And I thought he might be interested to know. So I wrote to him up something which he recognized as being not what it appeared to be, but he didn't, he's not very good at crosswords, I suppose. He didn't interpret it, so he just passed it over to people whose business it was, and that was the last he heard of it. Inasmuch as by that time he'd already examined one of these aircraft which had crashed in England, the information wouldn't have been very useful. But
if I remember rightly from your book, it was more of a personal code that he would...
Oh, well, I just invented it, yes. I mean, it was along the lines of, there's some very interesting old ox carts here, and one very similar to the one which we saw in Ray's shed. Well, he would recognise Ray's shed as the Royal Aircraft Establishment hangar at Farnborough that we had visited and seen a Heinkel 111, but with 4 oxen and implying 4 engines. But it didn't seem, the penny didn't drop. But anyway. But just as well, I suppose I might well have been shot.
You've told us about your interest in the theatre in Colditz, and presumably at some time or other you were involved in stooging for somebody or other.
Oh yes, well I mean that was the sort of thing which I suppose everybody stooged one way or another.
Did you know anything about the radio apart from the bulletins of
only that there was a radio and that it produced news bulletins. No, I mean it was a brilliantly kept secret. You don't, if you want to keep a secret, Don't tell anybody, even yourself, really, if you know what I mean.
Was it still an international camp when you got there?
No.
It was just purely British?
Yes, I think the last of the, I think French, was it, had moved out shortly before we got there. The room I went into was one they'd been in, and I don't know whether they'd left it in a mess, but it had just they'd been redecorated anyway, which was quite good.
Can you remember the chaps that were in your mess when you first went there? Presumably the two you arrived with.
No. No. The only other one that I actually remember was a Frenchman who arrived later, Tony Dupuis.
He would have been what, Free French, or serving with?
Well, he's serving with the British forces. Otherwise, he would have ended up against a wall, I suppose. But he proved he was serving with. Well, he was a British officer anyway. He ended up in Colditz, as indeed one or two other Frenchmen did.
Can you remember anything about any of the Germans there? Eggers or Preem?
Well, Preem wasn't there in my day. The two camp officers were Eggers and Pucke. Well, yes, one certainly remembered them because they were part of one's everyday life. Eggers, who's emerged since the war as a sort of friend of the prisoners, was always regarded in those days, I have to say, as a bit of a slimy snake in the grass. And Pucke as being a more correct, upright and honest guy. I don't remember much more about them, I must say.
The commandant, she would have had...
Well, had no contact with the commandant. The only contact I ever had with the commandant was when we were recaptured at Sargon, and we were taken back, and the commandant came out to look at us, and we weren't wearing any trousers because they'd taken our trousers away and our boots with a view to preventing us from escaping again. But as we were totally exhausted, and there were about 4 Tommy gunners in the van. But anyway, I think he thought we were improperly dressed as Luftwaffe airmen, and he snorted and walked away. That was the only reception I ever had from a commandant.
Colditz in particular, but I believe prisoner of war camps in general, is we see the films, we read the books, and there's these wonderful episodes and all sorts of things went on, but in fact there must have been a lot of time when you were just bored senseless. Do you remember that, or were you always able to...
I think you only got yourself to blame if you were bored senseless. There were so many things to do. Whether you were interested in music or books or theatre or the law or escaping, well, of course escaping was the principal thing to keep one occupied. Playing games, whatever, I mean, or just talking, you know. I don't think you were entitled really to be bored. Obviously, it was possible, and I'm sure it did happen. But
what about depression?
Well, there were, as we know, some people who became suffering from acute clinical depression. You don't need a prison camp to cause that, really. Well, yes, indeed. And I think if you had been taken prisoner in 1940, you would have every right to be depressed by 1945, quite honestly. Not least, I think, a lot of these guys at Colditz who are regular officers, they had this was their career, they trained and so on and so forth. Now's their big opportunity, and it just folds up within minutes, and you know, there's nothing left to do for the next 5 years.
Which of course is what happened to a lot of the army guys.
Well, absolutely so, and I'm amazed that they retained their sanity the way they did, in actual fact.
Was there anything that particularly annoyed you about the place or the people?
Colders? I don't think so.
What about incidents that happened there? Is there anything that particularly amused you or even saddened you?
Well, I think Colditz was a very interesting community when all was said and done. It was this extraordinary mix of people from the socially okay, the prominenti, relations of the Queen, Polish General Bor Komorowski, ordinary harmless blokes who just wanted to borrow an aircraft from the Luftwaffe and meant nobody any harm. You know, there's an extraordinary collection of people. So I think it was an interesting community, there's no doubt about that. Case, of course, at Sargon was when a big escape. This was after I'd been removed from Sargon. They sent in the Gestapo to search the place. Well, they were apt to do this, but of course they never found anything because they didn't know what they were looking for. They weren't professional ferrets or anything, but they also had a senior Gestapo officer who arrived in his chauffeur-driven car and went on a sort of tour of inspection. And the chauffeur was foolish enough to leave the car unlocked. And all his briefcase with all his papers in it was removed. And he was very cross.
I wonder why.
And so eventually the camp officer said, well, now we know you've got it, and quite seriously we advise you to give it back, because if you don't there will be real trouble. So it was given back, but it had the German census stamp put on it.
Very good. Is there back to Colditz again, is there an overriding memory that you have of the place?
Well, the big drama was the end of the war, of course. I mean, one has other memories, watching daylight bombing raids by the Yanks, listening to night attacks by the RAF.
Did the actual liberation, I mean, you must have known it was coming for quite some time before.
Yes.
It must have seemed to take forever to actually happen.
Well, it built up, so to speak. I mean, one knew that the Allies were advancing rapidly. Eventually they were advancing rapidly across Germany. And then one learnt that they weren't that far away. And then very quickly, in the course of, 2 or 3 days, you know, they'd arrived. And those few days were dramatic, to put it mildly.
Can you tell us the story of what happened once that had happened, once the Americans...
Once they actually arrived? What, into the castle, you mean?
Mm.
Well, there was total confusion. There were these Yanks whose... I think they must have come through a depot where they stored Grand Marnier, because their tanks seemed to be full of Grand Marnier. I do remember one of these guys saying, "Hi, buddy, take a swig of this." I doubt if he was in a fit state to drive his tank, actually. But no, it was such a sort of state of, well, confusion, really, you know. But it only lasted for a day, because the next day they whipped us out.
And you were brought home in Dakotas, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
Do you remember anything of that? I mean, I've heard various stories about that.
Well, I do remember that some people turned a little green.
The bad flight.
But I trust they weren't airmen. I do remember asking the pilot where we were going. I don't know, buddy. I was following the guy in front. Novel means of navigation.
Only one had a map. And then you landed at
Westcott.
Westcott.
I think some people went somewhere else. Westcott was where our aircraft landed anyway.
And were you allowed to go on leave fairly soon after that, or was there a debriefing of any sort?
Well, we're taken up to Cosford, which was the reception centre for returned prisoners of war. Well, you know, we had medical examinations, and I think that was about all, and then people straight away were sent on leave.
Are there any of the books on Colditz that you prefer, that you've read? Apart from your own, of course. I'm not sure that I've read any of them, except possibly Pat Reed's. When I started writing this book, I deliberately didn't read any other prisoner of war book, because I didn't want to be influenced by some style or something. So I thought, no, I won't read any of them, notwithstanding people kept giving them to me. What about films or the TV series? Did you see those, and what did you think of them?
The original film, way back, that was very soon after the war, wasn't it? I thought it was very good. I thought it conveyed the atmosphere. The teleseries, well, I watched a few of them. The trouble is that in order to make a teleseries, every episode has got to be dramatic. So it would seem that every day in the life of a Kriege and Colditz had some high drama in it. Well, of course it didn't. I mean, they're quite good, I think, yes.
Much. That's the end of my questions, and you know, it's been thoroughly fascinating.
No problem.
Thank you very much indeed. Right.